From a man so technologically incompetent that he can no longer take cell phone pictures because he ran out of film and doesn't know where to get it developed, this is the Daniel Natal Show. In Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, he has a section entitled Universal History. In it, he talks about how history has an arc, a pattern. There's a system underlying it. This aspect of his conceptualization kind of reminds me of Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. In it, she talks about the importance of pattern recognition. The cultivated mind thinks in systems. The uncivilized mind regards reality like an animal does, as a series of random events. Meadows says that this is why the evening news is worthless, because it merely gives you out-of-context occurrences without illuminating the underlying systems that made the events happen. Likewise, history, like the evening news, can be written to show you the underlying events, or designed to distract you with flashy colors and twinkling lights to distract you from the causal agents of actions. Hegel, like Donella Meadows, praises historians who think in systems, who see the underlying patterns of events, who understand the deeper mechanisms. Hegel, however, excoriates those historians who, instead of going down deep and showing you the underlying systems, instead veer off into arbitrary anecdotes that don't really illuminate how history happens. Instead, they'll concentrate on some fringe figure instead of showing you the principles who moved events along, kind of like Common Core history books, which literally spend more time on ex-slave Harriet Tubman than on George Washington. Moved by their social justice theories, these fake historians, as Hegel would see them, neglect the actual men who drove and shaped the historical period and instead focus on some irrelevant figure. Regardless of her otherwise commendable traits, whether Harriet Tubman lived or died wouldn't have changed American history one iota. Whether George Washington lived or died would have altered everything. So to neglect Washington and to draw inordinate attention to Harriet Tubman would, to Hegel, be an example of fake history. It shows you events out of context, randomly, like how an animal experiences consciousness. Cicero says that the education of a free man consists in teaching him how to think. The education of a slave, by contrast, teaches him what to think. The Common Core version of history doesn't show you how events took place. They just bring you random irrelevancy in the attempt to teach you what to think. You're expected to memorize rather than understand. Philosophy is understanding. But these fake historians hate philosophy. According to Hegel, philosophy is to them a troublesome neighbor, for it is the enemy of all arbitrariness. He adds, there is a wide circle of persons who seem to consider it incumbent on a learned and ingenious historian drawing from the original sources to concoct such baseless fancies, and form bold combinations of them from a learned rubbish heap of out-of-the-way and trivial facts, in defiance of the best accredited history. Setting aside this subjective treatment of history, we find what is properly the opposite view forbidding us to import into history an objective purpose. Objective history is, of course, showing you the individuals whose efforts molded the events and altered their age, inflection points in history. Subjective history is when you pull out some random marginal individual and focus inordinate attention on them to satisfy an agenda. Kind of like when I was talking to a local professor who was fine with tossing out the entire Western canon from Aristotle to Shakespeare to Mark Twain to instead focus on the writing of an ex-slave from the 1700s, whose work influenced no one. Her reasoning was that though the ex-slave wrote plodding simplistic prose devoid of insight or ideas, she should be overly praised for spelling monosyllabic words correctly due to the fact that she had darker skin. After all, she reasoned, white males have been too dominant and influential, so we should abandon the people who actually shaped the age and instead cast a spotlight on some nameless nonentity who no one read at the time and who no one reads now. As I said, this, according to Hegel, is fake history. He writes, the only truth for mind is the substantial and underlying essence, and not the trivialities of external existence and contingency. It is therefore completely indifferent whether such insignificancies are duly vouched for by documents, or as in the romance, invented to suit the character and ascribed to this or that name and circumstances. The humanity professor's excuse for promoting the ex-slave's writing attempts are justified on the basis of her being a real person, and her diaries really existing. Hegel says documentation of her is irrelevant. She had zero impact on the age or on the culture, so to give her disproportionate space at the expense of the actual iconic authors is an act of fake history. Long story short, when the apostles of social justice foist upon you fake holidays like Juneteenth designed to place inordinate emphasis on the history of slavery in America, what they're doing is history with an agenda. They're concentrating on the subjective and denying you the objective. They're creating a fake story arc and trying to get you to concentrate on random out-of-context events and figures to deflect your attention away from the actual trend line of the nation. Think of it this way. Imagine someone studying the history of the Roman Empire and never being told about an emperor or senator, but only told about an irrelevant cobbler from some provincial town. Imagine studying Egyptian history and not being taught about the pharaohs or pyramids, and instead being taught about a woman who baked really good bread for her family. Would you consider yourself well-versed in Roman or Egyptian history if this was your experience of it? Likewise in America, as there are real movers and shakers, real influencers like the Federal Reserve or billionaire oligarchs setting policy, they want you concentrating on Jamal, who picked 14 bushels of corn in 1832 and was left-handed. This is fake history, and it's a distraction method. There are real events happening right before your eyes, but like a cat with a laser light, they want you looking left when what's really happening is taking place on the right. Instead of learning how to think in systems, they want you to have the unfocused, out-of-context animal consciousness of a savage. The elites stink. They hate it when we push their buttons. Help us to push their buttons by pushing our buttons, the like and subscribe buttons. Also, don't forget about thenewamerican.com. Think of the magazine less as a newspaper than as a newspaper. You know, like the Greek nous, knowledge. Note to self, multilingual Greek puns don't work.